Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Jackie Ottmann. Thank you. Inge chikenda miomayan. Miseaka megokpe pamotang dizanakas. So very honored to be in your presence today, and that's what I just said. Very happy to be here. It is a privilege that I have to be introducing two women today that will share just very important perspectives. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Regina, I'm actually from Fishing Lake First Nation, which is in Treaty 4 territory. It is about 2.5 hours from here, and I just feel very much at home when I'm in Saskatchewan. I do have my brothers and sisters from the University of Calgary here also, so it's great to have them here. And so I am actually the Vice Provost of Indigenous Engagement at the University of Saskatchewan, and that's a post that began for me on October 1st. And again, recognize the work that's being done in universities and the advocacy that has been had over a long period of time for Indigenous voices to be respected and to be a part of the fabric of our academy. The University of Regina is predominantly situated in Treaty 4 territory with a presence in Treaty 6 territory. Treaty 4 is the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, Lakota, and Dakota peoples and is the homeland of the Métis people. As educators in these territories, it is our collective priority to ensure all learners gain a deeper understanding of our shared histories and contemporary relationships. Indigenization and reconciliation are our collective responsibilities. Laurie Whiteman is the Executive Director of the Treaty 4 Education Alliance. The Treaty 4 Education Alliance originated from a collaboration of the tribal councils, independent First Nations and chiefs whose aim it was to design and implement a common strategy with a common goal of First Nation student success through student retention, literacy, numeracy, and Indigenous engagement. And with that, I would like for Laurie to come up and begin our session this afternoon.
Good afternoon. Jackie didn't tell you that Fishing Lake is having the groundbreaking for their new school on Fishing Lake First Nation after decades. The kids totally deserve it. Well, miigwech, mapio hotankawin kamenosing anakwadizanakas. My name is Laurie Whiteman. I come from Regina. I grew up here. I was part of the 60 Scoops and was in foster care and made my way back home. And so on my dad's side, I am Anishinaabe from the border between Saskatchewan and Manitoba, Treaty 4 territory. And on my mom's side, I am Dakota from the Standing Buffalo Dakota First Nation. I want to thank you first for inviting me to be part of this. It is just really a deep privilege to be here sharing with Dr. Battiste and with Dr. Ottmann today and with all of you. I had the pleasure of spending some time with some of you yesterday out in Treaty 4. Some of you came to paint with us and to learn some Nehiyaw languages and just to learn more about what we do at Treaty 4 Education Alliance. And that's what I've been asked to do today, very briefly, is share with you a little bit about what I do with 8 First Nations in Treaty 4 territory. So in 2010, T4EA, as we call ourselves, we set a goal for our work with the nations. We call it Treaty 4 Nation Builders. Setting a goal at that time in 2010 was important because without a goal that's distinct from the provincial goals of education, we risk losing our inherent and treaty rights. We are all treaty nations, and the elders have told us that our efforts in education must be courageous and visionary. Build a 500-year plan. That's what Senator Saul Sanderson told me when he came to visit me in 2010, shortly after I took the job with T4EA. You can imagine how challenging that's been in the context of Indian Affairs funding. But it's courage that we need the most. Courage to look outside of the structures that have oppressed us and diminished us. Courage to look beyond the existing structures that were never designed for us, that continue to imprison us in constructs that don't work for us. And courage to look back and see the wisdom of 7 generations who resisted and continue to convey messages in the here and now about the strength of our cultures and about the profound wisdom of our ways of knowing. I'm inviting all of you to participate with courage in seeing the power of what Treaty 4 Nation Builders can contribute to our nations and to the world. Our chiefs are leading the development of a model of inherent and treaty rights-based education. Right now, we're just entering negotiations with Canada. This model will fundamentally impact training and development of the people who will serve to support our children into nation builders. I'm reluctant to say the word teachers because even that term carries baggage and places both privileges and restrictions on the individuals who have or don't have a paper that says that they are or aren't a teacher. I'm reluctant to say the words school or classroom or grade because those are constructs that limit us in imagining learning spaces that may have far greater potential. So maybe these ideas seem unattainable, but I'm guessing that many of you share the same thoughts and ideas and much more. Today I learned about museum hacking, and I want to take that idea and start hacking schools and lots of other places. I'm sure many of you have heard the saying that education is our buffalo, and if we believe this to be true, then it becomes our responsibility and our obligation to build systems that ensure that all of our children thrive and survive. Miigwech.
Thank you for that, Laurie. And I'm very excited about my community gaining a school and having a groundbreaking as was shared after decades of again advocacy by leadership and families within the community. It's really challenging to be teaching out of portables, not just for a year, but probably for about 10 years now. And so it's that's very, very good news for my community. I have the privilege of introducing someone that I've looked up to for years, and someone that has given me strength in the academy from a distance, whether I was as a student at the University of Saskatchewan or a faculty member at the University of Calgary, and now back at the University of Saskatchewan. I've always felt that I've had the support of Marie Battiste and her husband Saugage Henderson. So Marie Battiste is Mi'kmaq educator from the Potadek. Did I say that right? Pudelek. Yes. There's a certain way of saying it, and it's not how you see it on print. First Nations, and so it's a First Nation community out east. And she is professor in the Department of Educational Foundations at the University of Saskatchewan. with graduate degrees from Harvard and Stanford. She is a senior Indigenous scholar in Canada whose work in advancing Indigenous knowledges, ethics, and pedagogies had opened new areas in research and inquiry. With four honorary degrees, St. Mary's, Thompson Rivers, University of Maine at Farmington, University of Ottawa, she is an elected member of the Royal Society of Canada since 2014, a Canadian organization of over 2,000 Canadian scholars, artists, and scientists peer-elected as the best in their field. She is a recipient of the Distinguished Academic Award from the Canadian Association of University Teachers, a recipient of the Distinguished Researcher Award at the University of Saskatchewan, and an Inspired Award for her contributions in Indigenous education. She has published widely over 20 chapters, with over 20 chapters in books and journals, and authored 2 books, Decolonizing Education, Nourishing the Learning Spirit, and Protecting Indigenous Knowledge and Heritage, a Global Challenge. Co-authored with Sage Henderson, and edited 4 books. Just a very avid author. So with that, I would like to ask Dr. Marie Battiste to come up and share with us her talk entitled Decolonizing and Indigenizing the Academy, Achieving Cognitive Justice.
Gwe. Oh, good. We're all hooked up. Gwe and Madawalok Diok, Weldasi Nimolo, Weldasi Begizing Utet. Nindewizi Malij Battiste, Podla da Tlewi. I'd like to begin, first of all, by acknowledging my ancestors, my people, who have been very much a beginning part of my life as I came to know myself as an Indigenous person, but not the one from childhood. And I'd like to share a little bit about that as I go through this. I had a clicker, which was, I don't need it. Okay, I had a finger. Anyway, so so first of all, I'd like to say that the whole issue of protocols of place has been a very new endeavor, as all of you know. And the protocols of place is a way in which Indigenous people have always honored their relations. We always honor the people who we are crossing through people's territories. We honor where we are going. And part of that was something, as Mi'kmaq people, we always carried our wampum. And as we moved through territories, we would bring through that particular area an awareness of what our intention was as we moved through it. We would have white wampum to celebrate new wonderful things like a new chief or new births and so on. And if it was purple wampum, it might be of something like a chief's death or a war or some kinds of things. So Mi'kmaq people have always had the wampum as a symbol of our, as our moving through various territories. And so part of what I have done is to show you by this big map of the ways in which how all of this land is Indigenous territories. And on these Indigenous territories live many, many people, some of whom have treaties and some of whom have other agreements, such as those in the north and some of those in the far west. But I would like to acknowledge that Treaty 4 territory of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Nakota, the Lakota, and the Dakota peoples, and the home of the Métis people. And so as we move forward, I would like to also share where I come from. And I come from Mi'kma'ki. And Mi'kma'ki is the land of the Mi'kmaq, which stretches over 5 provincial territories in the in the eastern Atlantic seaboard. And it is in that place that my people are living on unpurchased and unceded territories. As I was born in the United States as a young, during the time of the centralization era, my parents at the time were moving through what we call this era of Mi'kmaq resilience. It was in the era of time of centralization when the federal government had been moving all of Mi'kmaq people from their self-sustaining territories and moving them into centralized reserves. Some of that was on promises of education, promises of health services. Some places were to give a church, a chapel, and many other kinds of services. And then to move them from the harbors and from the waterways wherein all of the settlers were then given those lands, which had yet not been purchased or even ceded by any treaty that we had. Rather, that our treaties that we entered into, peace and friendship treaties, were treaties that said we would share the land with settlers who were coming from, our treaty was with the crown, or with the monarchy, and with the king. And that allowed all of his subjects to come into our territory, and that he made sure by the proclamation of 1763 to tell all of them that if they needed or wanted to buy land, that they had to buy the land and purchase the land from the Indians who lived there, and it had to be with their consent. So that kind of thing happened, and our people and settlers came in and took up some of their spaces and lands, and pretty soon tickets of location, which the governor gave to the settlers at the time, ended up there believing that they had received some property by these tickets of location, and began to assume that these were, and began to sell their lands as if the lands was actually theirs. In all of those territories in the East Coast, those lands have not been purchased. My parents were a resilient people. They spoke Mi'kmaq language very well. They were familiar with the land. They were familiar with the ways in which they had to live on that land. And it was during the era of centralization that my parents moved on to because they were working with the season, went to Maine to work for a season. And it was at that time that they decided to stay longer. In so doing, they ended up staying more than 25 years in the United States, where now I am a member, a citizen of the Micmac band of Aroostook Indians in Mi'kmaq in the state of Maine, as well as I am a treaty citizen of the Mi'kmaq Nation in Baudelaire. So as I grew up in the States, I saw a lot of my people coming through, visiting with my parents and speaking the language, and so I knew that I was Mi'kmaq. But I also lived in a place where during the era of the 50s and the 60s, racism was very alive and well in all of those places. And so our life was kind of a marginalized life. My father worked as a laborer, my mother worked as a domestic. But was that at least they had employment, but the most important thing they wanted was for their children to have an education. And so even though one of my sisters went to residential school for 3 years while they were making that road to the United States, we all ended up in the United States and getting our education there. So what we were experiencing at the time was a great deal of this marginalized life living in Houlton, Maine. And I think that it was at that time my father really urged us to do the best we can, to work hard, and to get the education that he said would make a difference in our lives. And I never knew what the difference was until basically I began to spend a lot more time going back to my own home community and seeing what kind of lives our people had led, and what moved my parents away. And it was through that my mother had a third grade education, my father with a fourth grade education, and most of the people who came to through our school or came to our community, came into Holton, were those who had very rarely had more than a fifth grade to a seventh grade. And by the time anyone hit the seventh grade, that was when everyone dropped out of school. So my mother urged me to go on and get my education and to become a teacher. She decided me to be a teacher. It was not anything that ever I said, I'm going to be a teacher. But she said, you're going to be a teacher. And so I began that path thinking about what it was that I needed to do in terms of how do you change things around. And so it was that as I went through school and got my education degree, and after that went on to I was then recruited to go on to Harvard University, where I met my husband, who was my tutor in law in a course called Public School Law, struggling to get through all of those things. But basically, it was a way in which, for the first time when I was at Harvard, I had one Indigenous teacher. And it was a Native American scholar in the States. And it was from there that I really bloomed and discovered what the world was like. And I began to realize something about ourselves. I discovered that colonization was something that had been going on all around the world and was not just something that happened in Nova Scotia and to my own parents or my own people. It was that marginalization was worldwide, an epidemic. Powerlessness was something we all lived with, exploitation of our resources and of our peoples, and racism and violence were the kinds of things that we had lived with all of our lives, and somehow here we were. I was faced now with the world's issues, and I thought that all of this was because of who my people were, who my parents were, and who Indigenous people were. And it was not. It was something that I would come to learn was that my people, strong, resilient, place-based cultures with languages that were deep and that we had learned from our Creator and had carried with us for many hundreds and if not thousands of years. That our worldviews and our spirituality was something that had been always, and that we didn't need to have a Christian church come in and tell us that all of our spirituality was bad and that the only one that we had was a Christian religion. We were people who were related to each other. We were related to the land. We were related to the animals and to all of our ecology from which we grew. And it was in that we had grown thousands and thousands of years and as resilient from the very teachings that our Creator had given us through our creation stories, through our origin stories. And it was then that I came to know that all of that which was denied us, all the things that we had been told was bad and that we were to throw away and adopt this other culture, this language, all of that was the indigenous knowledge that had lasted our people for many, many millennia, and that it was a way of being in relation to all things. As I went on to Stanford University, and also taught at University of California, Berkeley, at Stanford University I took a course. And the course was from a fellow by the name of Martin Carnoy, an economist, an educational economist. And it was in that course that I took with him that I came to learn about something else that was really important in my life. And that was that the course was called Cultural Imperialism in Education. And as he talked about cultural imperialism in India and Africa and in the whole of the world around us, how all of this knowledge was going out and how imperialism was taken up in the economy and education and so on, I then had these tremendous aha moments, as you have when you're in graduate studies and you read this for a minute and somehow Spirit starts talking to you and you begin to say, aha, This is what it's all about. And indeed, this is what it was all about. That we had been marinated in Eurocentrism. That all of that education, all of that racism, all of that marginalization, all of that violence, all of those years of subjecting my people to the belief that they were nothing but a ward of the state was something that was all a lie. That we were independent people, that we had signed treaties with the monarchy, that we were nations and we had a nation-to-nation relationship. And they were to share, as we gave them some place to live, to come away from their oppression. They were to come here and share with us. And what they did is they took over. And they took our lands, and they took over all of our places, and they drove us into thinking that we were nothing but their subject, which we were never, a subject of the British Crown. So Eurocentrism came about as a result of multiple layers of theory, multiple layers of thought, all of those that were wrapped around the notion that there was a European center characterized by superiority and progress, hegemony, monopoly over all knowledge systems. And that knowledge system was something that they diffused to the world. And that diffusion of that knowledge throughout the world created those cultural imperialism in all of those places. And it was characterized by a singularity of God, a singularity in a way of being, a singularity of a government, a singularity of law. It was around certain kinds of what was knowledge and how you learned it, and a singularity about how you got it through institutions, in schools, and in universities. And all of those were centered around the periphery, and all of us were supposed to be happy to be getting this wonderful, superior knowledge. And so this dominant theory is multiple. It's ultra theory. It's in the work of, if you go to James Blout's work on Eurocentrism and the diffusion of knowledge. But in that, the dominant theory, it was legitimized. It was legitimized in science, education and public institutions, in the curricula, in publications, print, media. In other words, in everything. I can't tell you there isn't anything that doesn't fit for that. And so as I had that course, I remember writing my first paper. And my first paper, the major paper that I gave for that, it wasn't cultural imperialism alone that happened in that time. It was cognitive imperialism. When you take away a person's language, when you take away their family, when you take away their home, when you take away their land, when you displace them and move them as they moved us, this is far deeper, far more than even brainwashing. To me, cognitive imperialism is the great stain on the Canadian educational system. And that stain is the thing that we need to be working toward and out of. So cognitive imperialism was built on the imperialist knowledge and damaging assumptions. It relied on the colonial dominance of patriarchy, of racism, classism, homophobia, and other ableism and otherisms. And it was reflected in the privileging of colonial languages. I speak only English because of this system. You might have some who speak French, but we have very few, if any, other institutions that are coming from any other of those languages. It comes in the discourses, the knowledge, the values, the beliefs, the customs and practices, and the Anglo-Euro cultural origins. And it creates all the othering of all difference, and in those differences, the inequities. So what it has done, it's inflicted the soul wound on the individuals, the soul wound on the people, and the soul wound on the land. What it also has done is it defines success. All success is defined within assimilation to dominant Eurocentric norms. Oftentimes when I go out to speak at different communities, people will say to me, "Oh, you are such a great model for your people." And really what they're saying is, I speak their language, and I speak it well. And I have theory, and I have discourses that even some of those people don't understand. So I must be a model of Eurocentric assimilation. And I say, I am not a model to that. But what I would like to be is a model of Indigenous knowledge. And that has been my journey in terms of recovery. So what this Eurocentric cognitive imperialism has eroded our collective cultures and languages and communities by the privileging of Euro-Canadian languages of English and French. It normalized those multiple oppressions, and it dismissed us by, and often still do so, by notions of political correctness, free speech, or even academic freedom. What we do know is that our people, like my sisters and many of my family members, are still recovering from their being swooped up, taken out. Those who come with a 60 scoop have been removed from our communities. They have then, as residential schools, has constituted an assault on our culture, or on our children, on our families, on our self-governing and self-sustaining Aboriginal nations. And the impacts, said the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, said the impacts of that residential school system was immediate and have been ongoing since the earliest of schools. And Canadians, more importantly, said Murray Sinclair so often to us all, is that Canadians have been denied the information, the full and proper education as to the nature of Aboriginal societies and the history of relationships with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. As I teach a course in the College of Education on First Nation, Métis, Inuit education, which I would say is a great thing to have, but this is only the second year that a course mandatory for First Nation, Métis, or for all students in education has come about. I've taught the course now 2 times. And I'm beginning to move on my way out as I go to a reduced time appointment. And that, I've been there for 25 years teaching anti-racist education, which was a needed place to start, but it should not have taken that long to get us to a place where we now have to, all people should know about the residential schools. So these violations are really around the violations to Aboriginal and treaty rights and to the education of Aboriginal children. My daughter helped me to do these slides. She said, "Oh, let me do your slides. It'll freshen them up." Thank you, Annie. I'm not sure what that brain there is all about, but I think it's head, heart, hand kind of notions. But every researcher, and I think that's everyone in the room, and that's not, without exclusion to any of us, and that is that every one of us has been both a victim and a beneficiary of the same educational system. Some of us, like myself, I can't complain. I've done 25 years and gotten a really good salary for 25 years, so I'm doing good. So I've benefited, but I've also been a victim of that system. And many of us have been victims and beneficiaries, and we really are beginning to a place where we recognize that there really are few places where people are privileged with the knowledge of how to achieve a decolonized education, and that we are all critical learners and healers also within a wounded space. So over the last 40 years, we've been talking about indigenization in all kinds of ways. Indigenization seems like it's kind of a new thing, except that the very kinds of things that Indian control of Indian education came up with in 1972 as an idea about where they wanted to go, and the slow growth of indigenized programs for students, for and about students, prevailed in educational institutions at the university level. So what we have is now maybe more than 2/3 of the universities now offer some kind of transitional programs for Aboriginal students, whether it's in law or medicine, or whether it's in the undergraduate program, social work. All kinds of places have done that kind of work. And more have found that counseling really helps, that if you offer some kinds of services, counseling, whether it is individual counselors or even counseling units, that basically these do have helped the Aboriginal students get through school. And there are more than 350 initiatives in more than 55 universities aimed at promoting Aboriginal student access, retention, and success in the places of learning in the Canadian universities. And in 2010, I did a report with Alex Wilson, which you can find online, which did a review of the models of Aboriginal students or models for Aboriginal students in post-secondary education. Not sure what the title of that was exactly, but what it was, we did a report for Australia that asked, give us your best practices in post-secondary education in Canada, and we wrote this report and did a literature review. But there are different kinds of models that have been done, very early being the assimilation and enfranchisement models, and starting with Civilization Act in 1857, to later looking at other models in the 60s and 70s, more looking at equity issues for Indigenous people, the Indian control of Indian education, some constitutional reform in 1982, and then a whole lot more of the student support models, and then dual programming. So you'd have, law for some Indigenous students here and law for non-Indigenous, and or, for social work or nurses or educators, and ITEP programs came from them. And what we've come to know over the years is that the outcomes after 40 years of Aboriginal education initiatives have done not an awful lot. Yes, it has gotten some people through, and there are a few statistics I'll show with you in the next slide, but basically we still have, after 40 years of this kind of work, we still have grossly underrepresented in leaderships of education, professions, businesses, government decision makers, social institutions. We do have at least 4 Indigenous ancestry presidents of universities, but look at the number of universities that we have and colleges. That doesn't take into account. We've been pressing for the VP, the next levels, and so we just got Jackie to come in this past year, so we've got that. But all the rest of the institutions across Canada have not yet got to that place where they think that that's an important place. So we still have, RCAP came out in 1996. And at that point in time, they were talking about 9%, it was 8 point something, nearly 9% of people who were going through universities who had Aboriginal ancestry. And today, we have 11%. We've kicked 40 years up and gone up, a couple of points. So we really haven't made any significant moves if we look at Census Canada. And so we get 90% of Aboriginal students have not attended universities, about 70% have not graduated from secondary school. So when Universities Canada came out in 2015 and said, we need to change this, we have 13 points we want to happen, and those presidents got together and they began to think about what needs to happen in our universities. And first of all, they wanted to close the gap. Well, the gap is kind of like the statistical inequalities, and that's what the gap is. All the things to which Indigenous people have here and non-Indigenous people have there, and that is the gap in between, and there's a lot of it. So we need to do, in the press release of UC in 2015, they said we need to strengthen Indigenous communities. Okay, are we the fault for what's happened? We need to allow Indigenous people to continue to strive for self-realization. How about self-determination? We need to enhance the informed citizenship of Canada. Why don't we talk about treaties, not enhancing citizenship? I got a citizenship talk tomorrow morning, 8:15, if you want to come. There's the contributions to Canada's long-term economic success and social inclusion. And while that's an important thing for us to have jobs and so on, but it first has to be that we need to build our own nations, we need to build our own strengths within our own communities, and to have our people go back into those places and build them, not necessarily to strengthen the Canadian economy. So the effects on the earning potential is great, and I do have that there is many reports that have been out there saying if you do increase the Indigenous students passing through the system, there is a great benefit to that. It benefits the Saskatchewan GDP by $1.8 billion. It works on the closing the education gap will bring in $90 million to Saskatchewan alone, said Howe, and then Canada's GDP would be expected to rise by $401 billion with $115 billion saved on government expenditures. Well, okay, those are good. I can accept that that's how you're going to measure success. But there are other ways to measure success. And some of the things that we've been trying to do is in the work by trying to get our Indigenous scholars to begin to do the research in their own communities about their own self-determination and what is it that our communities are seeking to have, but also to recognize the strengths that we have within our communities. And some of those strengths are coming out in the ways in which we are writing about our knowledges, our ways of knowing about the kinds of systems where we can learn from. One of the things that I wanted to focus to start off with is that a lot of the work that has been done has been focusing on cultural inclusion. When we think about cultural inclusion, we think about culturalism. I love this piece of work that was done by Catherine McConaughey in, I think it was 1990, maybe 2000. But it was coming from Australia. And she talked about culturalism in Australia. And I got some good ideas from that at the time. But at the time, what she was saying that culturalism is like, culture is used as the way to identify the problem. You identify the problem. They got lack of culture, they got a lack of language, they got a lack of this and a lack of that. And then the answer to the problem that you've just identified is we got to give them language, we got to give them culture, we got to give them more, community-based, we got to give them more knowledges and so on. So culturalism becomes the way of looking not only at the problem but also the solution. And I think we have other ways to look at this particular issue. Because what happens is that when we look at culture as the problem, we ignore the hidden norms that privilege Eurocentrism, whiteness, dominance, and the normalization of the status quo, and ignores racialization and racism in the system. When we focus on the student, remember all those different programs for the student. Well, yes, those students do need help. But when we focus only our attention on the student and what it is they need, it becomes a pathologizing of First Nation Métis youth to their low rates of success due to the lack of skills and knowledge and cross-cultural capacity due to the language, culture, and community schools that they're coming from. And so we provide literacy tools and counseling and First Nation hires. But what it does is it ignores the oppression they're coming from. It ignores poverty. It ignores the fact that if you live marginalized in a society, that you will have all of those kinds of lacks of because of the position that you've been put in that society. So we need to not just look at the individuals who go through school and check off the box as success. We need to begin to work on the disparities in the income and the disparities of the self-determining nations that they come from, and correcting the impoverished situation they live in. So the other part of my critique is about the focus on equity. When we focus on Indigenous students as another of the charter groups, in other words, a lot of my students say, well, I really think we need to do cultural stuff with Indigenous students. But I have all kinds of Ukrainians, and I have new refugees, and I have students who are coming in from all different places. And so what that means is that they are seeing Indigenous people as just another one of the many who have needs. And what that happens is that when we're looking at this from a sheer equity point of view, that we're losing sight of the treaty. That the reason why everyone was allowed to have lands in these particular territories, whether it's here or other places, came about because of the agreements that were made with Indigenous people and through treaties. And they came in with an idea that they were going to not just allow you to be here, but they were going to support the resourcing in a shared way. With what we have is we've got a whole society that's grown up and have so marginalized Indigenous people that they actually think that we are wards of their government, instead of the nation-to-nation arrangements that we have that continue, and that the courts have affirmed over and over again that this is a nation-to-nation relationship. And now this government has begun to talk in that same vein. But we do have some transforming context. How much time do I have? So we do have some transformations happening. The Indigenous Renaissance is something that is ongoing. We have Indigenous scholars. We have post-colonial, post-structural scholars, feminist scholars do support the kind of work that we're working on. I love Elizabeth Minnick's work. We have the work of the Accord on Indigenous Education, which came about in 2010. And my daughter said, "Oh my, that's so old." Really? 2010, so old? Well, we still don't have an Annie for it being all so old. You know, all those colleges of education all across the country were supposed to do this. Respectful, welcome environments, respectful, inclusive curricula, challenging existing frameworks and structures, culturally responsive pedagogies, mechanisms for valuing and promoting indigeneity in education. Not all of them have that yet. So what we did was bring in Graham Smith some years ago. This is what the principles of good indigenization for universities are when you look at it from the Maori point of view, okay? Respecting the right of Indigenous self-determination. The legitimizing of cultural Indigenous identities and aspirations and goals. The incorporating culturally preferred pedagogy in education. Mediating socio-economic difficulties by building capacity, that is with graduates and business and infrastructure, and that's the work that Linda Smith has been doing with great success. I recall they said, we're going to have 500, PhDs in 5 years, and by goodness, they did it. I don't even think we have yet got 300. Do we? I don't think so. But anyway, so participation in the shared vision of Indigenous communities, dreams for restoration and reconciliation, addressing the factors as social determinants of health. So we do have, the Constitution that helps us to build new warriors. That's my husband. Halifax paper in the years of the constitutional growth. But anyway, the Constitution does provide, it creates constitutional fiduciary obligations on the federal and provincial government to respect Indigenous knowledges in Aboriginal education. The Treaty First Nations education provides schooling for children based on the desire of their parents. That was what was in the treaty. It's based on their desire and when they're ready, and so on. It wasn't like, we have to send you all to residential schools, go. It was like when we want it, and how we want it, and what we want in it. And that is the kind of thing that we still need to have. So the affirmation of also the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People came about in 2007. The other things that we're working with are the Supreme Court of Canada that continues to say that wherever there is an Aboriginal right, there's a corresponding right to teach that. And Indigenous parents have that right. All of us have a right to teach our Indigenous knowledges in schools, and we should be able to move all the way through an educational system with those knowledges, and to be able to have our people, those knowledge holders, to be our teachers, not necessarily those ones who go through, like me, and get assimilated because they can write a thesis or a dissertation and then be able to then write in Tier 1 journals. So when we have our promotion and tenure, it shouldn't have to be because you taught all these people, in this society. We need to know that we have to teach our own people in our society in a way that will be able to foster our own Indigenous knowledge and strengthen it. So reconciliation is, again, about the Aboriginal and treaty rights. Been reorienting the Canadian constitutional framework in education. And so it's important that provincial institutions, they have their own Education Act. They have an Education Act. But if it is going to be inclusive, it needs to include and has to be founded upon the treaties. And that's the first reconciliation place that needs to take place. Institution must understand the mandatory force of constitutional reconciliation that the court has created, converge the different constitutional sources of power, creating complex, interrelated issues that should be addressed in transforming the outcomes. So mine, and actually I borrowed this from Linda Smith, actually. Linda Smith, Decolonizing Methodologies, is really a two-pronged process. One is that we need to understand what are the deconstructing our own systems of how things came to be. Deconstructing the systems that Indigenous people were not part of when they were created. And when we begin to think about what it is who we are and what our education has been and where we are today and what our discipline has taken and what has it excluded, we need to really expose that. We need to look at the ways and we need to expose the political, moral, theoretical inadequacies of the colonial and culturalism education that we have received. And we need to reconstruct. And part of that reconstruction for me is a reconstructing and transforming of education and unleashing the potential of students. It is about recognizing all the things that the residential schools did to Indigenous people and then reconstructing their knowledge base, reconstructing their language, reconstructing their communities, reconstructing the relationship that's now built upon a fair and equitable sharing of resources. So decolonization is what I do. I've got books out there, please buy them. But it tells you these. I'm going to skip around because I know that, how much? Oh, whew. All right, here we go. Slide through. Okay. Decolonizing education, changing all of these things, but understanding that each one of us, every single one of us, has a place to begin. And that beginning might be in situating our own privilege or our own oppression, and recognizing how our oppression and our privileges have come from a singular source of Eurocentric knowledging and systems that have supported or not supported them. And Indigenous people have been alongside of that path, and that we are now at a place where, with constitutional reconciliation, the courts, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, we now need some new changing. And some of those new priorities are going to be in the healing of post-residential school students from their traumas and reconciling the Constitution of Canada, creating Indigenous knowledge in the academy and content, foundations, teaching, professionalization, and materials. It's in developing respectful protocols for working with research, with Aboriginal peoples, and so on. I'm going to just skip to, because I think some of this has already been done. Our calls to action to universities are in the number 57 and 92 to looking at the ways in which we need to really apply new principles, new norms, and new standards, and that reconciliation is really a head, heart, hand checkup. Reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship. between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country, and it has to be an acknowledgement of the harm. First and foremost is the acknowledgement of the harm that's been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action for change. And that is something that my daughter works with Big Brothers Big Sisters, and her head, heart, hand metaphor is one that she has shared often with others. And so it's a head and heart checkup. When we get the sense of what happened with people, how do we then begin to not just put it in our head about what happened with Indigenous people, but how do we bring it home to our hearts? And then when we bring it home, we begin to recognize that there are places that in our own lives and in the work that we do, in the professions we carry, in the research we do, that needs to have atonement of the work that needs to be done. And it isn't just a government job to do, it is in each one of us. And so unpacking the discourses of privilege that is not neutral in this society, moving things on, unpacking these things, will take us actually to a place of change in my mind. There we go. There's a bit of loading going on here. I will skip through, read the UNDRIP, in 1990, the Declaration on the World Conference on Science on the 21st Century said this in their report. Traditional and local knowledge systems as dynamic expressions of perceiving and understanding the world can make and historically have made a valuable contribution to science and technology. There is a need to preserve, protect, research, and promote this cultural heritage and empirical knowledge. And finally, I'm just going to give you this as my last slide to say, one of the things that a dear friend of mine is Professor Dr. Catherine Odora Hoppers. And Catherine has done this work in terms of bringing this notion of cognitive justice. Restorative action uses cognitive justice and transdisciplinarity as methods, and Indigenous knowledge systems and metaphysics embedded in them as an approach to opening up the gridlock in epistemology between the West and others. In this way, it pushes up to the fore the plurality of knowledges in all areas and economies and disciplines, in particular law, science, and economy, thereby fostering methodologies for systems transformation going forward. Healing and citizenship education is the undergirding principle in restorative action. My friend, Albert Marshall has talked about two-eyed seeing, and this is what my vision might look like. It's not the bridge with, we're going to meet, Indigenous knowledge. No, that's not what we want. We need to strengthen the fact that Indigenous knowledge has its own foundations, it has its own girding, it has its own way of being, and that we need to make sure that as Eurocentric knowledge develops their own cognitive bridge, that we need to recognize this is not the meeting of the minds, but rather a trans-systemic system that's going to get us to the next step. With that, I'm going to close because I know that you have a lot of things ahead. I will share this with those who want to have a copy of this. Recognizing that I have to figure out how to squish it down so it gets through, because it always comes back to me saying it's too big. There is another thing. But if you want to tweet today, you want to tweet me today, nothing about us without us.
To stay here. We're going to have question and answer. Okay, thank you so much for that, Marie. And there definitely is a lot to think of. And it just brought me back to the interesting time that we're in. And in terms of the conceptualizing the relationship between all peoples in Canada, not only in Canada but the world. I was recently at the G7 Women's Forum in Toronto, and that was just held a couple weeks ago. And in those forums and talks they inform the summit, what happens at the summit. And what I heard, especially on the main stage, was it's important to include Indigenous peoples and to be inclusive of Indigenous voices because it's really important for our Earth's health. The interesting thing about that is when you have a significant gathering like that, there was only one Indigenous woman on the main stage. Even though those messages were there, we have to be more inclusive, and so we're moving into a space I'm hoping is more meaningful, and I know that even that word authentic is probably not the right word, but what are those metaphors that we're using to guide our interactions and our relationships? And so I walked away from G7 somewhat with mixed feelings, in a sense that we do have a lot of just powerful Indigenous women across Canada that really could have sat on that main stage and provided some wisdom and insight into our knowledge's perspectives on not only on pedagogies or methodologies, but again, just that relationship, interrelationships that's evident in creation, how we really need to draw on that at times like this. So thank you again, Marie, for the very meaningful and insightful presentation. And I've written notes. I have my own questions, but what I would like to do is open it up to the audience for questions, and Marie will be here to answer them. And there are people here who have microphones, and so all you need to do is to put up your hand, and they'll be there for you. So,
see my slide?
Oh my, okay. Yeah.
That's how many.
I need Annie to do my PowerPoint presentations.
Okay, no questions, comment.
Okay.
Everybody's ready to go.
Yeah.
Must be a wine thing going on
there's
somewhere.
Over here. Margaret's got a question.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, over here. Yeah. I don't see a mic.
That's all right, I'll use my teacher voice.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Battiste, you've been writing into this for a long time. You're a SAGE for the Canadian Association for Studies in Indigenous Education. I and many other of my people in my community of practice have noticed a sea change since the release of the TRC report in 2015. Is there anything that you're noticing that makes you feel encouraged? Because in some ways it seems like there's been this sort of first flush, and then it kind of looks like maybe there's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear if there's something that you are seeing that you are particularly excited about.
Yeah, I'm excited about the fact that there is a lot more using of terminologies like indigenization and reconciliation everywhere. And I know that there are some people who still kind of, feel like they don't get it yet. It's still at a level of swimming in a lot of information. And I think that if we can continue to hold on to hope, that there will be beyond the discourse of indigenization, that we will get much more nuanced in knowing where we ought to go. I think that talking about treaties and the relationship and what Canada and the provinces need to do is still a place of some work. and there's a lot of things that need to go on there. And I think we all need to know what that is and why we aren't hearing that. In the book that we wrote with Visioning Mi'kmaq Humanities, Indigenizing the Academy, one of the pieces that was written by Nancy Peters was a beautiful, long report that looked at how curriculum went through and captured anything and everything that had to do with Indians all the way through to First Nations to indigenization, and looked at that to say, how did we come to not know anything, or how did we come to create our stereotypes, or how did we begin to diminish this group of people? And we see it as marked in the curriculum. And so education, educators, and the books that we've come from, all of that is written in this wonderful piece that Nancy Peters did in this particular book. And to me, it says that now that we understand where we came from, we now can come out of that. You know, we wipe the slate clean. We look at what we were, and now we can change that, and we can begin to think differently of it. So restoring, getting that, you know, location sorted out, getting our privileging sorted out, getting our oppression sorted out with each other, but recognize the differences that Indigenous people have are not just another charter group. And I think that to me, keeps on. I want that to be the strongest part that goes into how we take up indigenization, and not just a cultural inclusion model, not just an equity issue, not just we got to take care of these poor wards of the state kind of thought. You know, that's we need to move off that, and it has to be a more decolonizing, enriching kind of a way of looking forward. Thank you for your question, Alexis.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think we have to start thinking deeply about changing the narrative and changing the storyline within our institutions.
Annie.
I love it.
She didn't
I think
stop.
I
She
have
didn't
most
stop.
of. I have all of these books. So
Times two?
Times two. Times two. I've actually given them to my students and have used them in my classrooms over the years. But so changing our narratives and moving from, even though we have to begin with those conversations of why do we have to indigenize, why do we have to decolonize, and how is that going to lead us to reconciliation, and what does reconciliation look like? So moving from why to how, and moving from those comments of yes but to how. Right, and to deeply listening to those Indigenous voices, and I guess I should I forgot to mention that the Indigenous woman at the G7 conference was from Chad. So even though it was held in Canada, the Indigenous person was not from Canada. So we still do have a lot of work that needs to be done, and I am more of an optimist, I think, more than I should be some days, but I think that comes from the wisdom that I know that our knowledges have, and from those relationships with that wisdom and those people that hold that wisdom that I've had with over the years. So thank you so much again, Marie, and you've given us a lot to think about. So. At this point, I would like to just let you know that there is a CSSE reception and an ACDE award ceremony, and that's in the Rotunda at Innovation Place, which is about a 3-minute walk. So there's no need to drive there. So hopefully we'll see you there. Have a good conference.